Hello, welcome to episode number 192 of Learn with Lorna, Stories from Badenoch. My name is Lorna again. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service, which has 4 archive centres in the Highlands of Scotland, in Inverness, in Fort William, in Portree and in Wick. Every week I'm worried that I'll forget where one of our offices is because I always put them in a different order. This series, which tells stories from the Highland Archive Service collections which span over back to the 1200s through to the present day, so hundreds of years of Highland history. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we are very, very grateful for that. So welcome, this is the second pre-recorded episode before we get back to being live for a few weeks. Hopefully we should be able to be live for a few weeks, unless any more events come up that I need to do on a Thursday morning. This week, to tie in with the Badenoch Heritage Festival, then I'll be mirroring an illustrated talk that I'm giving at the Highland Folk Museum this morning. So I'll be giving an illustrated talk on stories from Badenoch, and so this week's Learn with Lorna is to kind of mirror that slightly differently, but same subject. So for those who are not local to the area, what and where is Badenoch? Well, it's not like most of the areas that I often talk about in that it's not a local authority specific area. It's not a county or a parish, but rather it's a historic entity, the Lordship of Badenoch, which later became part of the district of Badenoch and Strathspey. And it can very loosely, it's one of those things, because it's got such a long history, there's not a clear delineation, but it can loosely be seen as the land surrounding the A9 from around Drumochter to around Alvey, encompassing the civil parishes of Lagan, Kingusianinch and Alvey, before the road moves into Duthel and Rothimarchus and into Strathspey. So today we're going to take a bit of a jaunt through that area, looking at some, using items in our collections as a way to look at some stories from Badenoch. Now I'm going to start at Drumochter Pass and the Great North Road, as the A9 was called. It's always been a kind of important place to me. It's a feeling as you come in of the hills rising up on either side of you. It feels very different to Perthshire. So Perthshire, where you're in before you come in to Highland, is very kind of green and rolling and much more soft feeling. But as you come through Drumochter Pass, it starts to immediately become more Highland looking, these very high brown and grey hills. When I was little, the road often used to snow up, so it used to snow up at Drumochter Pass and at Slocht Pass at the north end, and so we would live in this sort of bowl of a little cauldron of safety. And the other thing is, when I was at university, I've spoken before about the fact I was at Edinburgh University, and I used to come home on the train, and it would be the place that would make you feel like you were nearly home, or the place that would make you feel like you were leaving. So it's a important place to me, and I think to a lot of people who've grown up in the Highlands, it's a place that marks coming back in. Now, the first settlement you might come to if you're journeying north on the A9 is Dalwhinnie, home of the whisky. This is on the very southern edge of the area that we cover as the Highland Archive Service before it turns into Perth and Kinross archives. And this is one of the places I always look out for deer. I'm sure any of you who have driven the A9, particularly in the winter, in the dark nights, it's a place you're always watching for deer coming down on the road. It's sort of surrounded by those high hills, some shooting estates, and so you're always very conscious of the fact that the deer might appear at any moment in front of the car. So that, if you're not familiar with the area, might give you a feeling of how the place looks and feels. We hold an 1873 document detailing the rental particulars of the shootings at Dalwhinnie and Brechachi, and this is how it is described. As to extent and probable stock of game on the ground, parties should send their keepers to go over the moors and report. So if you want to come and rent this estate off us, best thing to do is to come send your keepers up to see how much shooting there is on the estate. There was some disease in the early part of the season, but the present keeper reports that it ceased several weeks ago and that there is no disease at any time among the black grouse or ptarmigan. The bag of former seasons is not known to Mr. Davidson, and indeed it would be no fair criterion as to what might be expected, as Lord Marjoribanks always shot very lightly. There is no lodge on the ground, but ample accommodation may be had at the Dalwhinnie Hotel, which is quite close to the moor and within a mile of the Dalwhinnie station of the Highland Railway. Any specific inquiries will receive prompt attention. So you get a feeling of that the company advertising the rentals of the shootings. And interesting, as we'll come back to shortly, but the fact that there's no lodge, but don't worry because there's the Dalwhinnie Hotel, also relatively new in 1873. We're near a station of the Highland Railway, so you can get to us. And I also like the fact that they say, you know, we can't, there's no point telling you what's been shot in the past because the person who was here shooting didn't shoot very much, so it wouldn't be a fair estimate, which I just thought was quite funny way of saying there might be loads. We're not going to give you the figures because the figures might suggest it's not worth renting it. Okay, so we've got records like that as you're coming into Badenoch of those vast swathes of land being leased out for shooting. But also we hold records of those living in the community in Dalwhinnie. So for instance, if we have a look at the Dalwhinnie School logbook for 1918, we can see how illness was disrupting school life. And although it's 1918, it's not the illness you might be expecting if you're familiar with that period of history. 18th of February 1918, another child has contracted chickenpox and 3 households are now affected. May MacLeod, who was sent to Glentruim School for 3 months owing to illness at home, has been readmitted. Attendance is 7 out of the 13. 19th of February, acting on instructions from the Medical Officer of Health, I have sent Willie Shand home with disinfectants I have sent Willie Shand home until disinfectants arrive from Inverness. He has had chickenpox, but it is now in his home. Willie Mackenzie returned. And then the 20th of February, so it's quite unusual. Usually logbooks are written every week, but you can sense the fact that there's a crisis happening in the school with these illnesses, so she's writing every day, or he's writing every day. 20th of February 1918, received instructions today from Dr. MacDonald Inverness to close the school owing to the spread of chickenpox and to reopen on Monday the 11th of March. So closing for nearly a month to let the illness stop spreading. We can also see in this Dalwhinnie logbook the huge world events of 1918 impacting this little town in the Highlands in the mountains. 10th of May 1918, attendance this week very poor, 83%. Donald Mackenzie was off 3 days peat cutting. Willie Shand and John Crabe were kept off for 2 days when news was received of their brother's death in France. Lizzie Grant absent all week to help at home. Many schools were shut at the end of the war because of the Spanish flu, and it's really interesting that Dalwhinnie was open and the pupils were given a half holiday to mark the ceasing of hostilities. And as I say, it's quite often when you go to logbooks to look at the end of the war, you'll find the school shut because of the Spanish flu epidemic, this school shut, this school shut. So it's interesting that they've had their kind of epidemic of chickenpox a few months ago, and they're open at the end of the war, which means that they're able to have a half-day holiday to mark the end of the hostilities. And given that entry of those 2 wee lads being given time off because their brother's been killed in France, you think how meaningful that will have been to them that the war had ended, but at what cost to that family. On the other side of the hills, if you are coming up the A9 and you are passing through Drumochter and Dalwhinnie, on the other side of the hills to the east of Drumochter and Dalwhinnie is the estate of Gyke. And this is an estate that is precious to me because my brother-in-law grew up there, and it's given that they were together, he was together with my sister since I was 5, so he's always been my big brother, so it's a very special place to me and to others. And we have amongst D4, D4 is a huge collection that we hold, deposited collection of sale catalogues. These are sale catalogues of different estates and properties and houses that have been sold over the last 120 years or so. It's a huge collection, and we hold in there the sale catalogue for Guyck Estate from 1996. And what I found remarkable when I looked at it, aside from the fact that I found pictures of the family, what I found remarkable was that it reads very much like that 1873 one from Dalwhinnie. The same things are highlighted. So here are a few extracts from a sale catalogue of a very, very close piece of land 120 years later. And these are some extracts. The lodge at Guyck is one of the oldest sporting properties in Scotland, the original house being built about 1820 with later additions. It's constructed of stone with white rough casting and slated roof and stands in an enclosed paddock facing south, a short distance beyond the south end of Loch Anchellach. The lodge enjoys magnificent views of the surrounding hills and stands at 1,500 feet above sea level. The lodge is built on 2 floors and the walls and ceilings are mainly pine panelled. Over recent years, the present owners have carried out a programme of improvements, upgrading the plumbing system and double glazing some of the windows, but have retained the character of a 19th century lodge. It is furnished with many period items and pictures and is fully equipped for up to 12 people. It is the owner's intention to sell the property with all furnishings and equipment. Now, so far that's different from the Dalwhinnie one, which you might remember had no lodge on the property, but you could stay at the Dalwhinnie Hotel. But this one, this extract from the sale catalogue of Guyck in 1996. Like many estates in Scotland, the grouse numbers at Guyck have declined in recent years. In the last few years, the estate has not let any of the grouse shooting, but has kept it in hand for family and friends, and the bags have varied considerably recently. In 1994, 44 brace were shot. There is a reasonable stock of grouse on the Bran estate, a section of the estate, and it is thought that with more intensive moorland management, the numbers could be increased. There is evidence on the estate of lines of old grouse butts, with driven grouse shooting having last taken place before the Second World War. It's interesting to note that between 1964 and 1973, the average annual bag was 565 grouse. So, isn't it just very similar that they're pulling out the things that are going to be the selling point? What is the shooting like? How many grouse are on the land? And again, that record of, well, we can't really say for sure how many grouse or what the shooting might be like. One thing they didn't focus on much in that sale catalogue is the story of the Black Officer, which I've touched on before. But this booklet from our collections tells of that 1799 disaster. And it's quite a long booklet, so I'm not going to read it all, but it talks about how the story of this disaster of Captain John Macpherson has become kind of mythologised, and the fact that there are talks of a pact with the devil, and there are talks with how this disaster came about, and there's all sorts of other intrigues that have been built around this story. But this person writing the booklet in 1900 says, I am local, I know the people involved, and this is a true account of what happened. And this is what he writes. The glen, which forms the principal feature of the range of hills in the forest of Guyck, lies about a dozen miles south of the Spey at Kingussie. Its hills are smooth, steep and bare, and such sheer declivities that the glen in great snowstorms is subject to terrific avalanches, by which the deer sometimes suffer. And upon one occasion a herd of 10 stags and hinds were suddenly overwhelmed in sight of a celebrated deer hunter and gentleman of the strath who was stalking them at the moment when the rolling volume of snow descended the mountain and buried them in its bosom. So he's describing the fact that this very particular landscape with these steep sides is subject to avalanche, and so the fact that all of this mysticism has been attributed to the disaster, which I'll describe in a second, is he says is nonsense given the landscape this story is set in. It's entirely possible that what's happened has just happened. Some years afterwards, by an awful catastrophe of the same kind, when on a hunting expedition in the same glen, he himself, the party by whom he was attended, so the gentleman who saw the deer getting swept away, several fine deerhounds, and the house in which they lodged, were swept away on the night of a tremendous hurricane in the first week of January 1800. The persons who thus perished were the leader, Captain John Macpherson of Balachrone, and 4 attendants, Donald McGilvery, John Macpherson, Duncan McFarlane, and another man named James Grant. Several other persons had been appointed by Balachrone to accompany him, but they had been prevented by various causes, and upon the morning preceding the disaster, the rest had set out for the forest without them. Intending to remain for some days, they had taken up their lodging in a stone-built hut used as a forest lodge, which stood immediately under one of the long bare slopes described above. The night upon which the event happened was terrifically stormy, even beyond anything of the kind remembered in that high and mountainous district. Yet, as the forest hut was substantially built, and the party well supplied with provisions, their friends felt no anxiety for their safety until the 3rd day after the tempest. When, however, they did not then return, alarm was excited in the strath, and 4 or 5 of their friends set out in search of them. Upon reaching the glen, they discovered that the house had disappeared, and upon approaching its site, a vast volume of snow at the foot sufficiently explained their fate. Early in the next day, all the views in the person of a rhymester of the name of Mackay, whose verses on the occasion have consequently obtained extensive circulation and the honour of being frequently reprinted. In the words of the writer above quoted, the awful character of the destruction in Gyke immediately excited superstitious imagination, and in a short time it was exaggerated into a supernatural romance. By some, the house was said to have been torn to pieces in a vortex of thunder and lightning, launched by the vengeance of heaven against sinners. By others, it was attributed to a whirlwind raised by the devil for the same chastisement, while the detention of those who were prevented from accompanying the lost party was ascribed to dreams, warnings, and other supernatural interpositions to save them from the wrath to come. It's such a dramatic story of this disaster. The fact that there's a perfectly logical explanation for why an avalanche would happen where it did, but the fact that immediately there were stories of pacts with the devil, of God bringing this down to make the house completely disappear, of the fact that the devil had maybe brought this disaster to happen. And it has continued to be a very kind of romanticised story. Okay, if we leave Dromochter, Dalmini and Gyke, another way you could come into Badenoch, rather than coming that way through the A9, would be to come in from Laggan. Now, the area around Laggan has been a place of settlement for centuries, and we hold in our collections an 1879 plan of the ancient hill fort of Dundalave. And that is, you can still see it, you can still go there and walk up to it. It's possibly of Iron Age origin, but with 8 metre thick single rampart, 3 to 4 metres high, which is common in Pictish royal sites of around 300 to 800 CE. There are fantastic images of this on Ambala, so if you want to go and have a look, you'll see pictures of the fort as it is now, but also some imagined recreations of the fort. We hold a range of documents from Laggan, including this very dramatic document from our High Court papers. So this is written unto the Honourable William Mackintosh of Balnesbic, one of His Majesty's Justices of the Peace for the County of Inverness. This is the petition of Angus MacDonald, lawful son to the deceased Alexander MacDonald, tenant in Laggan in the Lordship of Badenoch. That upon Friday last, the 7th day of March current, 1755 years, at a burial and in the churchyard of Laggan, Alexander MacDonald, my said deceased father, was assaulted, beaten and bruised by Donald MacWilliam, alias McGilventich, and Donald Dow McTavish, both in Strathmashi, who, with great rungs, staves or battens, foundered and laid the said defunct as if dead upon the ground. And by the said unmerciful usage, my said father died upon Sunday's night thereafter, the 9th of this month, March current. and as the said Donald McWilliam and Donald Dow McTavish are guilty of wilful murder and ought to be prosecuted for the same according to law, may it therefore please your honour to grant warrant to apprehend and transport the above person complained upon to the county jail of Inverness in order to stand trial for the horrid crime of wilful murder. So this man's father has been beaten to within an inch of his life within the graveyard at Laggan at a burial, and then has subsequently died. And the witnesses to the petition signing this are James Stewart, writer in Ruthven, John Macpherson, merchant and postmaster in Ruthven, John Macpherson, merchant in the parish of Laggan, James Stewart, John Macpherson, and another John Macpherson. I seem to have spoken a lot about John Macphersons in this episode, which is entirely expected within Badenoch. But it's just a very interesting document. The fact that this crime has taken place and it's taken place at the burial, but also, like all court documents, it's giving us all of those names of witnesses within the Badenoch area. So you never know where you might find a reference to a person. We hold some great police daily occurrence books for Laggan. I'm making Laggan sound like it's a hotbed of crime, which I couldn't possibly comment on, but it just so happens that these are the examples I've picked for Laggan. We hold some great examples of police daily occurrence books, including recording all sorts of things, among which there's an entry relating to the police attending a Camanachd Cup match between Laggan and Kingussie in 1900. Kingussie would go on to win the Camanachd Cup that year, and that's only a few years after the Camanachd Cup was played for first. We also find in the Laggan police occurrence books the issuing of special military area passes in 1916. They record the fact that there's someone visiting from Sutherland and that they've had to issue her with a pass so that she can get back to Inverness and get to Dingwall and get back to Sutherland, because the Highlands is designated as a special military area, protected area during the First World War. And again, it's proof, as I spoke about in Dalwhinnie, proof of that war penetrating every single community. Now, whether you come into Badenoch via Dalwhinnie in the A9 or via Laggan, you'll end up in Newtonmore, a village that was established in the early 1800s. And it was originally known as Stronemuir, but there was a plan produced in the 1820s which referred to it as Newtonmore, the new town on the moor. And the town grew in part due to clearances of around 300 people from Glenbanachar, and then the arrival of the railway, which brought people to the Highlands. One of my favourite police daily occurrence books comes from Newtonmore. Have a listen to this. It sounds like it could be in a children's detective book. A letter of complaint was received from Donald Guthrie, gamekeeper, Glenbanachar Lodge, RE malicious damage, breaking down of growing trees, a birch, beech and rowan, which were at the side of the drive, committed sometime during last night, evidently by geysers celebrating Halloween. I proceeded to Glenbanachar Lodge, took complaint and examined the damage. The footsteps of a person wearing, I would say, a size 8 boot were visible at the foot of the trees and continued up the drive, finally going off into a field towards the village. I am now engaged in making inquiries. We hold a lovely typed copy of somebody's reminiscences about life in Newtonmore, written by Geordie Macpherson in 1982 when he was 97 years old. And here it's a long document, but I have just picked just a couple of examples to share with you. Perhaps I should tell you a little about my family. Both my father and my mother were of the Macpherson clan, see, lots of Macphersons, but not related as far as I know. Both were working at the castle when they met and married. My two grandmothers were alive when I was a boy. Granny East lived in Newtonmore and Granny West lived in a cottage on the outskirts of the castle. I think her husband was batsman to Cluny. Before I became, she's describing how he earned money as a child. So this would have been, he wrote it in, so it would have been very late 1800s. Before I became a herd boy during the school holidays, My family moved from the far side of the River Calder, where we had to cross the river by jumping from stone to stone with our boots slung across our shoulders by their tied laces, and then there was a scramble to get them on again and walk the other part of the way to school, about 2 more miles, I suppose. He goes on to say, I was engaged by a crofter for the 6-week holiday, and pretty solid work it was too. And when it was finished, the wife paid me my wages, 6 threepences. She put them in an envelope and stitched it carefully inside my jacket. Such a princely sum, she must have thought highwaymen were waiting to rob me. But as a herd boy, my first real job was with a bachelor farmer named Callum Badenoch, and his place was up the back of Newton Moor. It's quite funny, he goes on to describe these. He's got these wages, and obviously they've been sewn into his coat to protect him. But in a different job when he was still young, he describes, the Spey is the fastest flowing river in Scotland. I don't think that will have changed. He's writing this from New Zealand when he's 97. I don't think that will have changed, but I'll tell you of something that did get changed. My hard-earned halfpenny. He'd been given a halfpenny for this job, and he says, I thought that if I put it on the railway line and the train ran over it, then I would have a penny instead of a halfpenny. Needless to say, I had plenty of encouragement in this from the other boys. Well, it worked, but unfortunately the copper was paper thin and accordingly would not have been accepted in the shop at all. So he ends up having less money than he would have done if he hadn't tried to make it more. Now, leaving Newton Moor, we pass the remains of Ruthven Barracks on the site of Ruthven Castle. The barracks were built as a part of an attempt to control the Highlands during the Jacobite risings, and among our collections is a receipt from the barrack master in 1749. I said it was built on the site of Ruthven Castle, and that's got a really fascinating history. It was garrisoned by Cromwell's troops. It was occupied by the Wolf of Badenoch, who allegedly played chess with the devil there. And this brings us to Kingussie, for which we hold many, many record types. Many of the record types we've already looked at, so we have documents relating to school life, policing, maps and plans, and so on. But we also have for Kingussie something we don't have for anywhere else in Badenoch, and that's borough records, because Kingussie is the only borough in the area, but it's not a royal borough. It was created a borough of barony in 1464, got my numbers the wrong way round, and was redesigned as a planned village by the Duke of Gordon in 1799. And that was as population started to move across the river from Ruthven. Ruthven had been the main settlement, and people started to move over. And there's a really fascinating account of this on Canmore. So if you want to go online, have a look at Canmore, look at the general history of Kingussie. It describes the creation of the village around the possibility of starting a textile industry. And it's a really interesting story, but I knew I wouldn't have time to go into it here. Maybe I'll do a Kingussie episode. But from the point of view of our Kingussie borough records, it's the year 1867 which is important, because this is when Kingussie became a police borough and a town, and it's here that the town council minutes start. And they are, of course, full of information about life in the town, the big events and the small. So, for instance, we can see that on the 10th of December 1918 there was a meeting held in the Victoria Hall, and we have found the assembled town council discussing the purchase of oil for lighting the street lamps. A bit of a challenge because restrictions are still in place at the end of the First World War, and the Petrol Control Department of the Board of Trade have said their response is to state that they will not issue a licence unless it can be proved that the oil to light the street lamps was needed in the national interest. So again, as I've said hundreds of times before, that evidence of the global impacting the local. We hold around 1,000 volumes of Kirk Session records, and we hold Kirk Session records for all of the Badenoch parishes, for Lagan, Kingussie and Inch and Alvey. And the Kirk Session, as I have said so many times, often focus largely on discipline and antenuptial fornication and swearing and all of those kind of things. But they can also provide some real insights into times of hardship within a community. So for instance, this entry from 1783 in the Kingussie Kirk Session. 5th of July 1783, the session met and constitute. They took into consideration the state of the poor funds and upon examining the account of collections kept by the session clerk, they found that after deducting the sundry disbursements made by order of session since last distribution, there remained in his hands £2 11 shillings and 8pence, which, on account of the general scarcity that prevails and the consequent distress of the poor, they resolved to distribute, and they distributed the same accordingly in the following manner. So it lists everybody they gave it to, and it finishes by saying that they have given out every single penny they have because there's such a state of distress. We also hold a lovely series of architects' drawings from Badenoch Architects of Kingussie, as well as WRI records and all sorts of other collections. But I'm going to take us, before I go over too much in time, I'm going to take us to Kincraig and Alvey, where we'll finish. We have a collection of letters from the late 1700s from the Macintoshes of Balnesbic, who I actually mentioned earlier in that Lagan court case. But I was really struck when I was looking at a 1779 letter how cosmopolitan it is from this collection. So Lachlan Mackintosh is writing from London about events back in Kincraig, Dunachtan, Balnesbic, but in the course of this one letter he refers to people and events in Duntelchig, which is just outside Inverness, Fort Augustus, Strathnairn, Edinburgh, London, Portsmouth, Georgia, Antigua and the West Indies. And I just thought, as I was reading it, I was like, these are all just passing references to you because you are so plugged into what's happening everywhere. And it really illustrates the fact that the Highlands are not the back of beyond, and they were not the back of beyond. People here had a great awareness of what was happening across various other parts of the world, depending, of course, which part of society they moved in. And of course, not everyone had the lifestyle of a Lachlan Mackintosh. And if I have a look through the poor relief records of Alvey Parish, which Kincraig is part of, we can see this. Although again, this reveals travel. And just as an aside, we hold the poor relief records again for all of the Badenoch parishes, for Lagan, for Kingussie and Inch, and for Alvey. So if we look at May 1862, we find Margaret McBain or Warren admitted onto the General Register of Poor for the parish of Alvey. She's aged 76 and she's described as a Protestant, a widow, with an occupation of housework. It doesn't say whether that's her own house or whether she's doing work in other people's houses. She's recorded as being partially disabled by old age and a stomach complaint, and partially destitute. Now she's only described as partially destitute because her daughter Isabella lives with her. But it says in this description that her age and earnings are unknown. And again, it's an interesting kind of glimpse into the fact that in 1862, most people didn't really matter what age you were. We've only had statutory registration for about 7 years at this point. So the register says that she's partially disabled and partially destitute because she has this daughter Isabella living with her. But it also tells us about Margaret's other children. And it says, and again you can see this what I was referring to about the travel and the Highlanders going out. It describes that she has Robert, who's in Edinburgh, married with 2 of a family, Benjamin in Australia, Margaret, married and in Stanley, Janet in Australia, Anne, married and in Perthshire, James, married and in Alvey, Donald in Australia, Marjorie in Edinburgh. And for all of them it says ages and earnings not known. Margaret was given an allowance of 2 shillings per week plus coals and a wincey dress. So we can find both high society with those references to Georgia, to Antigua, to the West Indies, but also we can find people who are living in Dunachtan and need support in buying coal for their fire. So I'm going to leave you there on the edge of, in Alvey, on the edge of Strathspey. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and this wee wander through Badenoch and some of the records we have relating to that area. Thank you again for joining me. I hope you can join me next week. I'll be back live, all good with a fair wind behind us. We'll be live for a look at some historic police personnel records. But a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland's a charity registered in Scotland, and there is no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we are very grateful for that. Thank you very much indeed.